Hi, and thank you for joining us for Experimenting and Prototyping in the Classroom, Part 3 of a 4-part series, professional development series. My name is Francis Vigent, and I'm CEO here at KnowAtom and a former teacher. I'm hoping to spend a little time with you this evening taking a look at best practices for pairing students as lab partners, managing the inquiry classroom environment, and specifically materials and classroom management. If you missed either of our first two sessions, the first session was looking at integrating reading and Socratic dialogue. Session 2 was looking at planning as student scientists and engineers. And Session 3 is now looking at carrying out those plans. Now, we're going to be taking a look more from a teacher's perspective than a student's perspective in this particular session. Again, thinking about how our role is changing or has changed in this inquiry environment when it comes to students now carrying out their plan. So think of Session 2 as students actually engaging in planning. Session 3 now carrying out that plan. And we're going to talk a little bit about facilitating that transfer because that transition is key in terms of how we go about it. So we're going to look at managing that inquiry in the classroom, checking for understanding, and release of responsibility in this session as we go ahead. So first, managing inquiry classroom environment. So the first piece of this, when you think of having done the nonfiction reading and the Socratic dialogue, that transition out of Socratic dialogue into students planning their lab investigations, whether it's in a science context or an engineering context, what's really key here is that students are working collaboratively and partners. That's the way the curriculum's designed, but it's also a 21st century skill to be able to work in partners and collaborate. Now, when you're pairing students, there are certain best practices for pairing. Now, the goals of any lab partnership in terms of the way it functions, there's basically 3 components, and when you see 3 here, I don't want you to think 3 students. Really think about the smallest partnerships possible, which is 2. But really the goal here is that there's collaboration and agreement among the partners, that there's momentum toward a conclusion. So in this context of science, going from a question and actually being able to get the momentum through that scientific process to come to a conclusion that's evidence-based, that's based on data that was gathered by the partnership in an experiment, or in the case of engineering, the prototype and the test of the prototype and data gathered there, and the knowledge and practices to appropriately plan and also carry out a lab investigation. So those 3 things have to be present, and especially early on, students are not necessarily going to have all the tools to be able to, early on in the year, going to have all the tools necessary to engage appropriately. So that's where lab partners are a huge asset, because by having multiple students, they can round each other's strengths and weaknesses. When you are assigning lab partners, the general rule of thumb that we recommend is that teachers consider pairing low students with mid-level students. And the reasoning behind this is that by putting lower level students together, it's difficult to get momentum towards a conclusion because there may be gaps in knowledge or practices. There may also be some organizational limitations, or potentially just issues with being able to sort of be a driver for collaboration and agreement. So we recommend pairing lower level students, so a lower level student with a mid-level student, that especially a mid-level student who's more of a teacher type, somebody who's going to be respectful and also help solicit contribution from their partner in that sort of respectful relationship, and not necessarily just doing the work for somebody else or marginalizing one person's ideas because they feel their own idea is best. Partnering mid-level students together with mid-level students works well, again, rounding each other's skill sets out. This one here, sometimes people think is, oh, obviously you would pair high-level students with high-level students because, boy, they're high level, so we should, send them off to the stratosphere to be even higher together. But what's important to realize here by pairing high-level students with high-level students is the reason we make this recommendation is really because lab partners have to agree. So in a lab partnership, there is not one student working on one hypothesis and the other student working on a different hypothesis. There's not two different prototypes going on because each person has their own idea. Within that lab partnership, those two students have to agree. And high-level students, especially at the elementary and the middle school level, can be self-appointed experts who have developed some negative behaviors in the sense of a lack of ability to agree and collaborate with others to the point that it is a detriment to momentum towards a conclusion. They may have distinct knowledge and practices which they're unwilling to share, or again, back to that collaboration and agreement. And so they need to learn to be able to deal with people like themselves. And so from a classroom management standpoint, instead of having sort of self-appointed experts going off in directions independently and not learning any skills which actually will help them to be a part of and manage teams, what we want to do is put them together so they develop those skills. They have to use them and develop them. And it gives you a point to be able to check for understanding and then also understanding of how to meet these three goals. And if the students don't understand that, then you have a point to redirect as well. So again, this is a 21st century skill or understanding of a 21st century skill and practice, but it's really crucial, okay? If you have students, low-level students who have scribes or an aide of some type, that person just can be a third member in the team and sort of listen reflectively or, again, just play the role of scribe for that student. But again, in the lab partners, each student has their own lab notebook. Each student is collaborating with their partner. So in a partnership, two lab notebooks should really be identical. But that partnership is going to be different than the partnership next to it because they may be investigating a different hypothesis, have a different approach, entirely different procedure that they've designed, and that's fine. Important though to really take notice of. What's going on in those lab partnerships? It's carrying out these processes, right? So whether they're working on a question or a problem, answering a question or solving a problem, they're going to either be in the role of scientists or engineers, and that's their serious job. And so they're going to have to go through and apply their practice skills in the context of one of the processes. And that's, again, in our previous session, we discussed what we're seeing here. So going from that nonfiction background on Socratic dialogue, transitioning into the problem or question, that's what these two students are doing. They are acting as partners. They are collaborating and agreeing and making or gathering momentum toward a conclusion by applying the knowledge and practices, so the knowledge that they've gained from the background reading and discussion and perhaps their own experiences, and using their practice skills, okay, to get to that conclusion, which is ultimately going to be a conclusion about a prototype that they have to envision, build, and test. That look like in terms of the classroom for materials management? Because again, over here we're talking about lab partners. Here we are talking about planning, and now really how is it that manifests itself, or how do we organize it in terms of classroom and materials management? Well, the first thing that happens, so this S is our students and T is a teacher. You can just picture this as being that place where we had Socratic dialogue. And these S's may even be pairs of students. The first thing that happens where students are at their desks is that the transition from Socratic dialogue into planning is really just that. It's students entering into planning in the form of a nonfiction text. So the problem or the question, and then carrying out, let's say, the scientific method with a question. So, okay, that's planning happening at student desks. what happens is that as the teacher, you're going to be setting milestones where those student teams need to come and check in before advancing any further in the process. Okay? Early in the year, you may need to facilitate this a bit where you do a group think and basically go through the process. So you have a question, and then ask questions like, well, we're going to do a lab together. So students set up the lab and just basically open their book, come up with a title, and and you discuss that together in real time. And you have this question, and then you would ask probing questions like, what's required in research? What's a fact that's relative, and then of course they'd say, well, facts that are relevant to the question. Well, what's a fact that's relevant to this question? What do we know from our reading? What do we know from our discussion? And pull it from the class. Get it up there. Now they can capture that and ask them, well, what would their hypothesis be? What are potential hypotheses? What is a hypothetical answer to this question? And then pull it from the group. Get it up there, and then the students capture that. Okay, that's how it looks like the first or second lab of the year. As you're releasing responsibility, those sort of things, the first, second, and third thing that you see listed here under either scientific method or engineering design process are low-hanging fruit. They're easy things for the students to grasp. But they're also foundational. So what happens is that as the students progress, once you go from hypothesis to summarizing experiment, now it gets more difficult, because to summarize an experiment means you have to have a bit of forethought. And as a teacher, you're probably going to have to put some materials out there and let the students know what materials are available and up to how much the students may use. So they may choose to use everything and all of it, or they may choose not to use everything in lesser amounts. And there's different reasons for that. Like if they could have 2 scales, would they want to use 2? Should they use 2? Or should they use 1? Well, they should probably use 1, because if you use 2, then you're adding variation. You're adding variation in there, variability. And so because one scale may not measure exactly the same as the other scale, so it may manifest an illusion in the data or false readings in a sense, and show, register a difference between observations where there is not one. Okay, so that red line represents a point where early in the year the teacher may choose to pull students back together when there's been a full release of responsibility for the first 3 to just have a quick point of discussion and clarification. But really what it transitions into is that each of these red lines become checkpoints, but where you tell the students, I want you and your lab partner, now that we have a question, to go through, set up your lab, and get through your hypothesis and come check in with me, and you've got 15 minutes to do it. And now you have students in 10 minutes starting to come up to you, and you've made it clear to them that once you check in with me, I'm going to let you go on to the next steps, and if you're ready, you can go get your materials and carry out your investigation when the plan is complete. And so what happens is this becomes a point of training students to self-regulate, self-direct, and also it really puts them in charge of their own learning, because one, it's structured. This isn't sort of open-ended, here's a question, see you in an hour with a conclusion. But what's happening is that you're creating these accountability checkpoints, and also you're checking for understanding not only of the students in the team, in the student team, but also the class. If you see 2 or 3 teams coming up with the same issue, you may need to pause and redirect the whole class or clarify an expectation. Also, the students don't get all the way through this and go completely off the rails. Now the thing is it's okay students make mistakes, but really your role in that Socratic sense, again, is to ask a question, and if a student is really insistent in backing up and has reasoning behind what they've done, let them do it. You're just there to, to again make sure that students are having the opportunity to be successful and considering, not basically you're helping them to consider options through questioning and let them experience things appropriately. You don't want them to sort of head down a track where they really misunderstand an expectation or start to create sort of an experiment that is just entirely not feasible because they don't understand the constraints in terms of materials that are available or something like this. So again, it creates this opportunity for accountability. It also helps when it comes to classroom management and materials management, because when students are planning, they do not have materials in front of them. Now, the picture I showed you earlier, you saw students planning with materials in front of them, but that's because the teacher chose to place materials at the tables, and they could trust that group. In other cases, the materials may be in the front of the room, and the students have to go up and take a look. They can touch things or whatever, but they're not actually creating at that point. From a material standpoint, that's important because you don't want students to get off task. They need to plan their investigation before they can carry an investigation out. Absolutely vital. Something else to mention here is that that as students are meeting these milestones, you're saying, hey, you know what? Great research, hypothesis, so on. I want you to go on and do the summary of your experiment. You know the materials that are available. Go ahead and do that and check in with me. Now, you may decide that they don't actually need to check in with you at that point. You may decide that you're going to let them, come up with a summary of your experiment, and then I want you to come up with a materials list and then check in with me. These red lines can be moved or removed as you feel like the students have built their muscles, in a sense, where they can get through from one stage to the next. Now, something else in terms of milestones, which we'll discuss a little bit later, is that this is the point to be, students coming in and sort of having a checkpoint, getting some redirection, and then heading back out. And the thing is if the student doesn't meet the expectations, they get sent back to fix it. That's the thing, is you don't get to go beyond a stage if you haven't actually met the expectations. So that's where a lot of the self-correction comes in too. They don't want to wait 2 minutes for you while you talk to another student just to find out they have to go back and fix something. So if you can direct them where to find, what a hypothesis should look at by having that reference in the front of their book, or asking them the question and then they have to go back and think about it and fix it and come back to you. They don't want to do that. They don't want to waste their time. They don't want to waste your time. They want to actually get to a point where they can carry out this plan. So they know they need it. They're thinking through it. And then after a couple of labs, you're going to see that they start to gain momentum. They begin to understand the expectations. They understand the process. And they become very good at managing it and managing themselves. By the end of November, this is where students should be. They should be able to go through the scientific process, or depending on what grade level you're working with, the engineering design process, with these checkpoints in place. They're not going to have a perfect sort of lab and not need any sort of, they are going to need some redirection, and you're going to have to challenge some of their thinking, but they're going to be able to do it. And then what happens is that, kind of like riding a bike, they're going to be a little wobbly and so on and so forth. But by the time they get to the end of January, this sort of another major milestone where students are going to be able to go through this really well. They're going to be very proficient at it, and that's key. If you don't make that first milestone 10 to 12 weeks in, you're not going to hit the second milestone, at say 20 to 22 weeks into school. So really, really important that release of responsibility happens. Once that back and forth, so again, kind of coming back to our model of the classroom, so the students are planning, so they're coming from their seats and, again, not having to be called on, coming up, waiting for the teacher. If there's a student pair there, okay, check in. Teacher takes one student's lab notebook, the other student reads it. Teacher's kind of looking, asking a couple questions, making sure that the students understand and are meeting the expectations at each of these stages. Thumbs up, I want you to go on to the next stage, and you've got about another 5 minutes or so. Go on to the next stage and come back and check with me, or go on to the next 2 steps, come back and check with me, and so on and so forth. So basically these students are just sort of rotating through, and the teacher's just sort of managing this environment. And what happens is eventually, and this is where checking for understanding is happening, with that scaffolding of those checkpoints and the redirection, that you get to a point where, like we were saying, you may need to show students materials. Now, from a materials management standpoint, your materials are kit for stations. Now that's on purpose. Remember I said we didn't want materials at all these tables? The reason is that if you put materials at all these tables, the students are going to say, well, wait a minute, instead of engaging in this thoughtful planning, I'd like to engage in tinkering. And there's nothing wrong with tinkering, but the thing is that we're not learning by accident or engineering by accident here. What we're trying to do is we're trying to actually plan a prototype or an experiment which is documented and something that can be replicated. And so, so the materials are placed at different stations, and once the students have developed their plan, so they come down, let's say in the case of science, they have their materials and procedure and a scientific diagram, they're ready to collect data, that means they're ready to carry out their plan. Then what they do is they can go from their seats as lab partners, and it doesn't have to be everybody together, because remember, if the students are checking in as a team, one team is going to get ahead of the others. The more on task you are, the faster you can move. And that's what's great, is that students who are on task are the only ones with materials, because you say, you know what, go ahead, you've got your plan together, carry it out and gather your data. So students go off and they gather the materials that they put on their list, maybe the cups and toothpicks and spoons from this station, and the motors and the light bulbs and the hot glue from that station, the batteries, wires, and plates from this station. They go back and they do what they need to do. Now this says hot glue, depends on the age group you have. And actually hot glue would be something that, when you think of a station, might actually be off on its own or on the corner side of a station, where as a teacher, see, standing right here, you can actually monitor that station so that you don't need 100 extension cords, and you have, students sticking fingers on glue to, show how brave they are. But instead, it's something that's up here and managed even if it's from a bit from afar. And so what's great about that is at the end of class, the students who were on task, they have completed their investigation, and now they have data that they, in the next class, can go on to use and analyze and form a conclusion. Other students see that student, and that hastens their progress because they want to do that. That's cool. How do I do that? And so I need to start checking in with the teacher and meeting my milestones. The other thing is, if you have students who are not on task, then those students don't have materials to play with and distract other students, and yet they're actually getting the example of what it's like to be a student on task. And you can clearly see who has what and what's going on, so you can go and intervene. Okay, that's really key. So that's why at the desks, what's happening is at first it's the planning and the checking in, and then at station, students gather those materials, and then they go back to their desks and they plan. And it's not lockstep. Again, remember, it's dependent on how those students are moving through that process. And so you'll see classrooms often like this, where students are talking to each other, asking questions, or the teacher may come by and notice students struggling with something and ask a question that would lead them in a direction. Now the thing is, in the case of engineering, you may see students struggling to build something, and you might ask a question which sparks an idea or a change of prototype, so they may decide to go and modify their prototype. You may ask a question that doesn't change their thinking because they're insistent that this is how it's going to be, and so there it doesn't spark a modification, and that's fine too, because they eventually are going to carry out whatever prototype test that they carry out, gather that data and reflect back, and then at that point they may reflect back on your question, or you could reintroduce the question during the debrief. The other thing that happens is that the students will start to actually really sort of pause if you come by and ask a question and really think deeply about it, because will start to actually think critically about what it is you're questioning. And so that is really huge. In a group think aspect, very early in the year, students may be planning labs as a class, but then in terms of carrying them out, once the group has planned the lab, students can carry that out independently in their teams like this. So you don't need to facilitate everything to the nth degree. They can get their materials, they can measure, they can follow the procedure, they can gather the data, and then they can form conclusions, because even though you all have the same plan for an investigation or prototype, that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be variation, because human error occurs. Students don't follow plans, and that actually becomes a teachable moment. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay. At certain points you may find, especially early in the year, if it's a first year of implementation especially, that you may have not communicated a clear expectation. Students may be confused about something because you didn't link it during Socratic dialogue in a tight enough way. So you may need to pause the group and have a quick sort of recall a couple quick points from the discussion, and then have another quick 3-4 question Socratic dialogue just to solidify the purpose or the connection to a specific concept or practice that should be happening but isn't, perhaps. And so that is a key kind of point of redirection there. So when you look at a lesson in your KnowAtom binder, what you're seeing is, of course, the materials and objective and prep notes. But when you see those stations, that's what we're talking about. And these items have been grouped by stations in this way to help prevent choking, sort of these choke points or clustering of too much certain materials in one area. So by distributing in multiple places, then you don't have a huge line of students at any one place where things get out of hand. And what's great is that if you don't get, another thing to mention is, if you don't get as far in a lesson as you hope to, guess what? All the materials are still at those stations. From a cleanup perspective, that transition is much, much easier. And when students are done their investigation, they know to bring their materials back to those stations. So again, cleanup gets easier. Okay. So beyond the Socratic dialogue notes here, when you see a lab like this, okay, so this is an engineering lab, and you see discuss the problem with the class, that's just, that's Socratic dialogue. Okay, you're discussing a problem, so of course if they don't know what a problem is, you're going to have to discuss that. But it's transitioning out of, or at the tail end of that Socratic dialogue where that transition happens. Now, we give you enough information here and also sample data that you could facilitate this whole thing. You could guide this whole thing, but you shouldn't. It's there if it's necessary, but that is sort of like break the glass, pull the alarm necessary. You have to be thinking about that release of responsibility to the students. Okay, there's going to be low-hanging fruits. They can certainly reference from a poster on the wall, understand through discussion and through the evolution of the curriculum, especially early on, who's a scientist, who's an engineer, what are these practices and processes, and then begin applying them. So as you group think, you've modeled it, but yet involved the group's thinking. Right? Use the group's thinking as the means to model. But then further, what you're doing, or what you want to do, is not guide everything, but release the responsibility and have the students bring back these sections one after the next, where we have those red lines, and they're going to vary, and that's fine. But you're not copying this and giving it to them. Okay, that removes the value for student learning. What we're going to look at here, the stages in release of responsibility, specifically stages of release, the timelines for release, and how to sort of scaffold that. And we've already talked about this a bit. So when you think about release of responsibility in terms of a timeline, for a school, and let's assume that you start on September 1st. For a school that's starting on September 1st, and again, lab notebooks start at the 4th grade level, so much of really all of what we've been talking about is really in the context of grades 4 and up. In the grades below that, there's structure that helps facilitate a lot of these transitions. So grades 1, 2, and 3, especially, you will see those transitions and a bit of a lab notebook template. And that's something that's built into the curriculum. Once you get to grade 4, this release of responsibility, because we're using lab notebooks that are really blank composition notebooks, there isn't that template, there isn't that structure, and it's appropriate to take it away. But it also means that you have to start with a bit of groupthink and introduce students to those processes, and really in a way that they are developing and using them. So that's why you see here guided to collaborative stage in the release of responsibility is September. So that's typically 1 or 2 labs, probably 2. It might be 2, actually it might be more like 2 to 3 labs. Okay, September into even a little bit of early October maybe. And then what you see is a change that goes from collaborative to independent. Okay, so October, there's definitely no guiding. It's now collaborative to independent. And then by the end of November, the goal here is to have independent proficiency with practices, okay, and developing STEM practice skills. And they're going to be practicing those in the context of the processes. So from November through, so the end of November through the end of January, what we're doing is we're refining students' performance of the expectations of the processes. Okay, so the goal is to have independent student proficiency with the processes. And what are the processes? That's scientific method and engineering design process is what we're talking about. So that's why earlier I was saying, you know, we're going to do some group think in September. That's the guided, and then it might be, you know, and that's as guided as we get. We're not going to just write it all up there guided. Okay, so some people may define that less as guided and more as collaborative. If that's the case for you, then collaborative. Collaborative to independent, we're going to be releasing responsibility for some sections, that's collaborative, and maybe pulling it together in group thinking other sections. Okay, especially the things that are most difficult for students are the summary of the experiment, really thinking critically about what materials and specifically the quantities that they need. And the number one most difficult for them to master is developing procedures. So to develop a procedure really takes some thought. Remember, students live in a highly engineered world, and so while they may be, you know, fantastic at advancing through a video game, that video game is engineered. It actually plays by certain rules. You can't just, you know, walk off and, you know, push a button. It does what you want it to. It actually does what the programmer programmed it to do, and so that's actually engineered. And so all they're doing is working a system. In this case, when they have to develop a procedure, they actually have to build a system. And as a rule of thumb in this curriculum, the procedure is 5 to 7 steps. Okay. One thing I will say is that in the case of chemistry, there are a couple of facilitated procedures, simply because there's nothing intuitive about it, and to just mix materials together for no purpose to try and, you know, try something by luck is not. It doesn't add any value for student learning. So that's the one exception to developing procedures, is in a couple of instances of chemistry. But otherwise, it's really November through January, the students are a little wobbly on the bike, and the bike in this case is carrying out the scientific process or the engineering design process. And from November through January, they become really proficient at it. And with a big winter break in there, you might think, how's that possible? Well, if you meet that November, end of November milestone for full release of responsibility, and let the students wobble and really practice the practices, and you do a good job of, as they're coming up, helping redirect and ask the questions and hold the standard high, the students are going to get better and better and better at that. Send them back, make them fix it before they advance, keep the timelines clear and short, and something students can feel, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes to do certain things. And what happens is that by the end of January, students are going to be not only proficient with the process, but they're going to be ready to start pushing the envelope. And so what happens from really the end of January through June is extending the performance expectations, or the students' performance of expectations. Okay, so those expectations are the practices, the processes, the disciplinary core ideas, the depth of connection, okay, the depth of higher order thinking, the application of the cross-cutting concepts, that's systems thinking. Okay, so the goal is really a deeper expression of higher order thinking. That's what happens January through June. So in this case, you're going to see less pushing for a period at the end of a hypothesis, or a hypothesis that doesn't have singular personal pronouns in it. And what you're going to see is yourself pushing for more diverse hypotheses, or more efficient procedures, or more clear and pointed use of data in forming a conclusion. Okay, that's the kind of thing that you see beginning in January. But you can't get there unless you release the responsibility in November. Okay. A point of caution here with release the responsibility and timeline is scope and sequence. So the sequence of units is intentional. It's ordered and it's nurturing. Now, when you think about that, you also have to think about the role that each unit plays in the following unit, and the preceding units play in that unit. You can't rearrange them. If you do, it's going to delay your milestones. It's also going to cause gaps in connection between one set of concepts and the next, in vocabulary and practices and processes. Okay. The other thing is that if you are trying to create tangential activities or supplements or scaffold away sort of student responsibility, then what's going to happen is you are going to fall behind in pacing, because the time on learning is a finite resource. And so you're going to be diverting time on learning away from the program and towards other things. The other thing is that with supplements and tangential activities, they oftentimes do not align well to the program, in the sense of the vocabulary is defined differently, science is defined differently, engineering is defined differently, scientific process looks different, if it even uses one. And so that sort of commingling causes confusion for students. And what you want to do is really not only activate student learning and form background and student connection through the Socratic dialogue, but you want them to be able to practice the practices and develop and use the content through these processes. Okay, so activating learning, but then actually accessing content through the practices and the processes. Okay, absolutely vital. This is really the core of the program. Okay, and that brings us to something that I didn't have on the list, but I want to talk about briefly before we wind up here, is different types of assessments that are in every unit. So below 4th grade, you have lab activities. So it's like a lab notebook, but it's more structured. 4th grade and above, you have lab notebooks. So lab notebooks are both formative and summative. Now, a notebook, we've already talked about this, is not note-taking. It's actually where students develop a non-fiction plan, which they are going to carry out. It's either a plan to carry out science as scientists or engineering as engineers. Now, it's summative because it shows you how the students understand the practices and processes and how they're applying them. It shows you their understanding and use of vocabulary and its appropriateness. So, summative there. Applications of math, technical writing, summing up a whole lot of different things. But it's formative in the sense that it informs your instruction in the moment, and because these units and lessons scaffold and they're articulated, what happens is that it instruction moving forward because those concepts connect. and those practices are going to be applied again, and those processes are going to be used again. And so this becomes an opportunity to create focus correction areas where you identify weaknesses and actually not only hold the processes at the same high expectations, but to make sure that you're providing additional clarity or focus in particular areas, perhaps for individual students or for the entire class. Okay, so that's a key, the number one assessment that you have here is that lab notebook. The next piece is that activities. So not every lesson is a full-blown lab, engineering or science lab. We do have science and engineering activities, which are still hands-on. They still use the practices, and they still follow scientific or engineering processes, but some of it is facilitated. So students will have ownership over certain aspects and not others. Okay, those, for the same reason as the lab notebooks, are summative and formative. Now, what you'll notice is in the back, so this is the labs. This is an exemplar for a teacher of what a lab at I believe this is like a 7th or 8th grade level would look like. So it's a bit more detailed than what you would see at something like 4th grade, but the steps are the same, the language is the same, the process is the same. Okay, it's just the depth is different. The other assessments that you see listed here are vocabulary and concept assessments. So vocabulary assessment looks something like this. It is summative. It tells you, this links to the exact definition that is used in the reader and in the vocab list and even in your teacher background, okay, for different concepts and vocab words. This lets you know if a student has mastered the vocabulary and understands it. Okay, you have different graphic organizers and things like this. So it's a summative assessment. We also have concept checks. Now, you see here concept assessment is a concept check. A concept assessment requires the student to apply their understanding of the fundamental standards, or the essence of the standard, and to then synthesize in some form. So you'll see here scenarios and a question, or text features with questions, and then possible multiple choice answers. Okay, this is not something they've seen before that they've learned, but it relates to that fundamental standard, and can be an application. Is going to require them to apply their understanding and synthesize. Okay, be able to identify the correct answer. Over here, it's even, from a synthesis standpoint, puts even more on the student, because you can think about it as students are doing an open response here. They are having to do a little bit of technical writing, and so there's a scenario, there's data, and there's a question in which they have to consider the scenario and the data very much like a PARC assessment to form a response. Okay, so this is a bit of a performance assessment, and we have ones that get even deeper than that. Okay, so this sums up a student's ability to think critically, to create, evaluate, and analyze in the context, but a new context, using what they've learned, the skills, the disciplinary core ideas, and the cross-cutting concepts in a novel context. So it really sums up a lot about that. And you can see that these types of assessments very much are like a PARC assessment or a PISA assessment, or even a number of other inquiry assessments that take place across the U.S. or internationally, NECAPs and others, where that scenario then leads to additional questions and new information, which precipitates additional questions as well. So when you think about the assessments that are available in the units that we've provided you, you have to think about, first and foremost, you can't assess the students beyond what's reasonable. So the core of accomplishing the goals and mastery in the curriculum involves these lab notebooks and assessments. So you have formative and summative assessments that are a part of this no matter what. Vocabulary assessments are great as homework, tickets to leave, exit activities, or something like that. Concept assessments are quite difficult because in most cases, under a traditional model of STEM instruction that you find in the United States or really anywhere, we see this abroad as well, to be able to perform well on a concept assessment, like a lab notebook activity or activity, requires higher order thinking skills, but the fact that it's an entirely novel context is something that students are going to have to be trained to understand what's being asked to some degree. And so I would not base my benchmark assessments on using concept assessments from the back of each unit. It's going to be very difficult for students beginning the year. Now, if you've had a program in place for 2 or 3 or 4 years, you are going to see students be able to perform well on these concept assessments. But again, ease into it and don't allow the potential for assessment to distract too much from the time on learning which you need to accomplish the actual labs and activities which form the real skeleton of these lessons and the scope and sequence of the entire year's curriculum progression. So if you have any questions on that, feel free to reach out. And of course, all the assessments that I'm showing you, in the back there are answer keys. All the answers are there. Sample data and answers. Sample data is in red. Answers tend to be in the answer key in red as well. But remember that when it's an open response or something of a lab, notebook nature, these responses are dynamic. So it's really giving you a sense of a direction, but student data may be slightly higher or lower. They may come to a different conclusion because they had a different hypothesis, and so on. So really this becomes an exercise in critical thinking, so you have to understand the essence of what's being asked. When you look at the answer, you have to match it with the question and really think about the essence there. Okay, my contact information is here for you on the screen. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Email is the best way to contact me. It's fvigent, F-V-I-G-E-A-N-T, at KnowAtom.com, K-N-O-W-A-T-O-M. You can also go to Contact Us. And all of these resources, in addition to being in your binder, are also available online. So if you go to KnowAtom.com and click Customer Login, use your unique username and password to get in, you can access all of this with the visuals, concept maps, and assessments, the answer keys. It's all there for you. Okay, wonderful. Well, I hope that this has been beneficial. Feel free to reach out. And otherwise, I look forward to seeing you in session 4, our final session in this 4-part series, where we will take a look at the unit design and really, when we talk about assessments, what differentiates next generation science assessments from the traditional, most often formative, summative assessments that we see in standardized testing. Thank you so much, and again, good luck. Bye-bye.